Hello, welcome to CSC 239, Cyber Law and Ethics. Today we're going to be going over the history of the Internet and also some international regulations. Because again, what we're looking at in this class is how difficult it is to take the 200 countries in the world, give or take, that have Internet access and then try to regulate it on a state level, a country level, and ultimately on the world level. So let's start with the history of the Internet. And the Internet is a legacy of what was called the Cold War paranoia. After World War II in 1945, as the world was really coming back to its own, there was a distinction between the Soviet Union or Russia and how they took over much of Eastern Europe, and then the other side of the Allies, which were England and the United States. Now, the U.S. didn't take over any countries, but they left military bases in Germany and Italy and England. So for a long time, many American GIs spent quality time in the 50s and 60s, 70s, 80s in Europe working to avoid what everybody feared, which was a nuclear annihilation. So we're going to fast forward to 1964. It's the height of the Cold War, and Americans are worried about an impending nuclear attack because remember, World War II ended in Japan when the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And since that time, there was this fear that it would happen again and it would be a bigger issue because at the time in 1945, the Soviets hadn't developed their own atomic weapons yet, but they had by the end of the 1940s. So that's when this paranoia about mutually assured destruction would take place. The government had a more pervasive problem. If the war did come, how would the military be able to communicate? A centralized system might easily be destroyed in wartime, and so traditional technologies not work. So you think today with cell phones and everything, but again, you have to go back to the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when phones were still attached to the wall. And there was no such concept of having any kind of communication device other than walkie-talkies. This fear impressed a need on the government to do something different, to develop a whole new scheme for post-nuclear communication, a way for society ultimately to survive. The Internet was designed in part to provide a communications network that would work even if some of the sites were destroyed by nuclear attack. If the most direct route was not available, routers would direct traffic around the network via alternate routes. So there's a little picture from 1980 of where the communications tended to stick. Now what you'll see is the East Coast, the West Coast, very significant, multiple points, and then in the middle of the country, not quite so many, but if you think of California being the 6th largest economy in the world, and the East Coast being, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Virginia, and all their cities, and most importantly, D.C., where our seat of government is. So the roots of today's Internet came from the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, a branch of the Department of Defense. Instead of performing its own research, ARPA regularly funded university and corporate research projects related to technological development or military problems. As much as the government attracted some very smart people, including Albert Einstein at one point, they used and funded a lot of university research. And at this time, Einstein was working at Princeton University, so a lot of these things were overlapping and kind of like a giant Venn diagram of all these famous scientists at the same time. In the 1960s, ARPA was tasked with developing a way for computers to communicate with each other and begin to fund programs at universities and corporations, including MIT and RAND. And RAND Corporation is a very important player through the 60s and 70s in the development of not only the internet, but a variety of other amazing technological developments. On January 2nd, 1969, designers began working on an experiment to determine whether computers at different universities could communicate with each other without a centralized system. The Corporation of Bolt, Beranek and Newman, or BBN, had been awarded the contract to develop the Interface Message Processor, or IMP, the basis of the new communication system. This would control the packets of information being sent and received from one computer to another. And again, this idea of taking all the bits and bytes that make up data, breaking them down to their most basic components, using those components to send the message, and then it all coming back together again, the bits and bytes fitting into place. If you think of a puzzle, you mail the puzzle to your friend unmade, and then they put it back together and they can see whatever message you wanted to send them. IMPs were small machines which were part of each host and were dedicated to forming the network between computers. IMPs would use a technology called packet switching, which split large sections of data into smaller parts called packets, and each labeled with its destination address. Packets could be sent in any order and through different destination routes, which all led to the same destination. Upon arrival at the destination computer, the packets would then be reassembled. And there's a picture of an IMP up there. Doesn't look too bizarre, kind of an older style audio system almost, and then there is how the hosts would receive their IMPs. Packet switching was the key. Under a traditional central system, all information had to be channeled through one source, processed, and sent off somewhere else. Packet switching, though, allowed for another method. Information could first be sent to one place, and if that site was not working or processing too slowly, it could be rerouted on the fly somewhere else. This concept, called dynamic rerouting, would allow all hosts to be equal. With every computer having the same routing abilities, an enemy would have to destroy nearly all computers on the network to be sure that communication lines were dead. And at the time, keeping in mind that there were certain designated locations for if there was a nuclear war. So, there was a place in Colorado in the mountains. There was, of course, some places in the Midwest that the Soviets didn't know about. But what they wanted to do was take out the major cities. And the major cities included District of Columbia, where our seat of government is. ARPANET was known as what we know of the internet back in 1969 when it was brought online under a contract led by BBN, which is that Bolt, Beranek and Newman, which initially connected 4 major computers at universities in the southwestern U.S. UCLA, which is in Southern California, Stanford Research Institute, which is in kind of central North California, University of California, Santa Barbara, which is midway between Stanford and UCLA, and then finally the University of Utah. So you get a little triangle there. This idea of computers, what you have to think about in those days in 1969, you're not looking at some desktop or laptop or even, a slightly larger desktop that maybe you had in your house when you were growing up. We're talking about rooms that were filled with giant processors, and you had 1 or 2 computers in there that did the actual processing. But everything was hand-loaded, there was tapes, there were cards. It was a lot more complicated than it is today. In 1972, ARPA became DARPA. I know, that was exciting. Ray Tomlinson was the guy who created the idea of email, and it was adapted for the ARPANET by Ray Tomlinson of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman in 1972. He picked the @ symbol from the available symbols on his teletype to link the username and address. And some people say that he picked it because it was the least used letter on the keyboard. Other people, they have their own perspectives. But again, at that time, the @ symbol was only used in accounting and billing purposes. So you can see why that became a symbol that was easy to adopt. And of course now everybody uses the @ symbol. It has its own key on a lot of keyboards. Soon the professors at these universities focused on sharing information through email. So you have somebody who might be working on materials development, they're an engineer, and they know that there's a professor at Stanford who has outstanding mathematics skills and they need them to help define the magnetism of the material they're developing. Well, now instead of having to call and then return calls, you were instead able to directly communicate through email instantaneously, and that was absolutely groundbreaking. Meanwhile, in 1989, another significant event took place in making the nets easier to use. Tim Berners-Lee and others at the European Laboratory for Particle Physics, also known as CERN, proposed a new protocol for information distribution. This protocol, which became the World Wide Web in 1991, was based on hypertext, a system of embedding links in text to link to other text, which you may have been using every time you select a text link while surfing the internet. So it's still used today, this technology that is over 30 years old. Although started before Gopher, it was slower to develop. So CERN and the United States government comes together to really integrate both of their research and develop the modern day version of the internet. More importantly, and this is extremely important, CERN made the decision to not attempt to patent or claim any copyright fees for the technology underlying the web. This meant that there were no restrictions on becoming part of the web, and as a result it became a virtually universal repository of computer-based info and entertainment. So, in a sense, what CERN did was made it open to everyone. Kind of like a library. Here it is. Anybody can come in. You can use this facility as much as you want for as long as you want. This was big because remember, we live in a country where the idea of how do we commodify or how do we make people spend money is super important to our capitalist spirit. CERN, being in Switzerland, they didn't quite have the same context. So CERN's contribution made the internet available to any and all people who could get on, which was amazing. The University of Minnesota, also a very important player in all of this. In 1991, the first really friendly interface to the internet was developed at the University of Minnesota. So prior to this, you had to know command line programming. There was a necessity of understanding programming to a certain extent, being able to do queries, that kind of thing. The University of Minnesota gave us a very easy system. And there's a little picture over there on the right-hand side, basically giving people files. You could go in and look at the mathematics resources or other information by subject. So this is a lot more of what we're used to seeing. The demonstration system was called Gopher after the University of Minnesota's mascot, the golden gopher. The gopher proved to be very prolific, and within a few years there were over 10,000 gophers around the world. It takes no knowledge of Unix or computer architecture to use. In a gopher system, You type or click on a number to select the menu selection you want. And back in 1991, I was lucky enough to be able to use a Gopher, and it was that simple. The US government initially, quote unquote, owned the internet. Since the internet was initially funded by the government, it was originally limited to research, education, and government uses. Commercial uses were prohibited unless they directly served the goals of research and education. This policy continued until the early 1990s, when independent commercial networks began to grow. It then became possible to route traffic across the country from one commercial site to another without passing through any government-funded NSF-net internet backbone. So now you have these independent sites cropping up, and your average consumer, if they knew Unix, if they were able to get on to a command line, they might be able to access this particular piece of the world. So, when did it become available to the whole wide world? Most people will say 1995. However, Delphi was the first national commercial online service to offer internet access to its subscribers. It opened up an email connection in July 1992 and full internet service in November of 1992. So Delphi was very ahead of its time. All pretense of limitations on commercial use disappeared in May of 1995 when the National Science Foundation ended its sponsorship of the internet backbone and all traffic relied on commercial networks. This is when AOL, Prodigy, and CompuServe came online. And anyone who grew up in the 90s can tell you that there were AOL disks everywhere. And it was, for a while, the most important commercial ISP in the world. So, we've talked a lot about these companies that you may not even be familiar with. Now, here's one that you absolutely know who they are. This is the wonderful world of Internet Explorer and Microsoft. Microsoft's full-scale entry into the browser, server, and internet service provider market completed the major shift over to commercially based internet. The release of Windows 98 in June of 1998 with the Microsoft browser Internet Explorer integrated into the desktop showed Bill Gates' determination to capitalize on the enormous growth of the internet. And, even today, the page you land on, whether it's Google, whether it's USA Today, whether it's Yahoo, or even AOL, there are a dozen ads. And every time you land on that page, those ads have the potential of selling you something. So having that landing page became essential to any company who wanted to make money off the internet. And obviously, the internet caught on with the public. In a general sense, here's some figures for you to look at. 1983, there were 500 internet users. By 2000, and this is about 5 years after the internet became commercially available through AOL, Prodigy, and CompuServe, we are now looking at 360 million users. By 2012, it had jumped to 2.2 billion users. 2014, 3 billion users, and by the end of 2017, 4 billion users. Now, the United States, interestingly enough, is the most internet-connected country in the world. However, the most users belong to Asia, because keep in mind that even though they only have about 50% penetration of the internet, they also have, between India and China alone, almost 3 billion people living there. So once China and India are able to connect everybody in their countries, the internet usage will go significantly higher. But right now there's 7 billion people and 4 billion of them are on the internet. So there you go. So let's talk about the internet and what defines it, its characteristics. First, openness, open-ended network architecture. The users shape the network and how it is used. So whether it is, you put together your own website or you are using someone else's website, you decide how you want to use it. It is asynchronous, so there's no need to coordinate communication at the same time. You can send an email to your friend halfway across the world and they'll get it when they open their email. It's going to be immediate, but there's no need for, an IMP to be turned on at your friend's house and an IMP at your house, because that's already built in. Many-to-many format of communications. Users can interact with any number of other internet users. Distributed network. No centralized destination. And again, that comes from our fear of nuclear annihilation. Data can take any number of routes to get to where it is going. And finally, scalable. The internet is not affected when new computer links are added or deleted. I mean, can you imagine if every time somebody updated Facebook, your entire page would reset itself? That would be a giant pain in the butt. So instead, this scalability is very important for the internet, making it easy to use, essentially.
Now, as we've mentioned in prior discussions, there are a lot of issues that have emerged from using the internet. We have an erosion of privacy, and in many ways trying to keep our financial information private has become almost impossible. The perversion of free speech, people flaming each other, trolls, hackers, that kind of stuff. Violation of intellectual property rights. Back in the early aughts, we saw the takedown of peer-to-peer music sharing sites. Back in the early aughts, nobody paid for music. I mean, I know still there's a lot of people who don't pay for music now, but it's people don't buy a lot more music. They tend to just listen to it. Also, movies, and we're going to talk about this in a couple weeks when we talk about the hack on Sony Pictures. Then we have fraud, that Nigerian prince who sends you an email every month seeing how you're doing. That's fraud. And then, of course, the hacking attacks. And this comic on the right-hand side, there's a guy sitting at his computer, and he's on his Facebook, and he says, "That's odd. I don't recall accepting a friend request from Big Bro 84. That is an allusion to the book 1984 by George Orwell, where society basically oversees everything, including how you think. And it is a capstone story of authoritarian governments and how they manipulate what we know and don't know. So this addresses the big question: can the internet be regulated? Issues surrounding the regulation of the internet. Number one, distributed architecture. There's no centralized core. Rerouting and switching is the backbone of the design. So there's not one place in the world that has a little box that says it's the internet. And when people try to understand what the internet is, it really is a matter of highways and roads that all take you different places, but there's not one central place that it takes you to. Number two, digital content is almost impossible to contain. You post a picture of your friend doing something really stupid like car surfing, that can get picked up, go viral, and before the day is out, you'd have 100,000 views. People copy, they paste it other places. Before you know it, there's no way, even if you take down your original post, that picture is not going to still exist on the internet. Number three, jurisdictional conundrums. Who has sovereignty over the web? Ultimately, a country only has jurisdiction over its territory. So when the United States talks about putting in, their laws, it only counts for the U.S. It doesn't count for other countries. And that is something that took a long time for people to learn and understand. So depending on the government type, you see different kinds of governments trying to manage their internet differently. So who ultimately governs the internet? There are a few groups that provide technical governance of the web. We're not talking about legal in terms of free speech, things like that. We're talking about the technical underside. Number one, the World Wide Web Consortium, and this sets the international standards. Number two, the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF. They set technical standards such as communication protocols. And number three, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, handles the domain name systems. They don't specifically distribute the domain names, but they decide who qualifies as a registrar of names. A major criticism of this organization is that it is made up of mostly Americans, even though it's supposed to be an international organization. And more importantly, America has the right to veto any decision. Kind of harkens back to our idea of, well, I built it, so I get to make the final decision. And then China and Russia have expressed serious reservations in working with ICANN. And again, we know that China has an authoritarian government. Russia has an authoritarian government. They don't want to be beholden to anyone. So this leads to the issue: who has control over the internet? When Yahoo entered the Chinese market, it had to sign the public pledge of self-discipline for the Chinese internet industry, and to censor what people will see in their emails and search results. And Google had to do this too. The issue here is that China has a very strict sense of what is allowed to be seen. Anything that's negative towards China or their leaders is censored. Any historical events that do not make China look good are also censored. So in Yahoo China, and this is a page that you could see, you get an error message when you're looking for something that would be negative against the country. We have already helped you filter out excess web pages. That's the nice way of putting it. On the right-hand side is a cartoon of all of these folks who create the Great Wall of China, and it's a digital wall this time. China uses firewalls to prevent its citizens from accessing pornography or human rights websites. So kind of put that as equals. And then they also censor negative information about government decisions. So on the bottom left, you have the internet in China, and he says, uh-oh, he searched human rights one time too many. And there's a hand coming out of the computer screen, whapping him on the head with a fishing net. And then on the right-hand side, what you see is a man standing in front of a tank with a computer with the little @ sign on there. This references what happened back in the late 80s, early 90s with Tiananmen Square. And this was a revolution in China when the students crowded into Tiananmen Square. And Tiananmen Square is huge. So the fact that there was probably 1 million students there protesting the authoritarian government. And at one point, a man stands in front of a tank, daring the tank to literally run him down. Well, that young man has disappeared and no one's ever seen him again. But that's what happens in authoritarian governments. Finally, and I have mentioned this before, there's something called Tor software. And it is a browser that activists have developed that will evade censorships and surveillance. In today's internet age, the main issue is the shifting power between the state and dispersed internet community. And remember, going back to chapter 1, according to Larry Lessig, the best chance for regulation is code, not laws. So if you want to be anonymous, truly anonymous on the internet, you use a browser or Tor software that will literally keep your identity off the internet. However, your identity still exists because whether it is your credit card through Target
or your shopping habits at Amazon, it's still going to register you. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. On the other side of the coin, if you are not in my class but still have a question, please leave a comment and I will respond as quickly as I can. Thank you very much and have a lovely day.